Hello, everyone. We do see that we have about 17 attendees. We'll give a couple more minutes for more people to log on, and probably around 2:05, we'll get started with the webinar. And then thank you all for joining. While you wait, feel free to use the chat box. If you haven't used Zoom before, there are features on it that allow you to chat. And then there's a button next to the chat box that says Q&A, and that's what you can use to present questions that you'd like us to answer at the end of the presentation portion of it. And I'll repeat all these instructions again in about 5 minutes once we officially start. Yes. See, while we wait, I had some polls that I can put out there. While we wait for more people to join the webinar, I've launched a poll. If you are interested in passing the time, you can answer the question. The question is, are you interested in research on celiac disease? I'll just give it another 10 seconds and then I'll close the poll. Oh, actually, maybe another 10 seconds from here. It looks like we got some more respondents. All right. Cool. So the first poll that I just shared right here, looks like we've got about, 69% are interested in clinical research, and a couple of others a no. So thank you very much for joining and interacting with this poll right here. I think it is now basically 2:05. So shall we get started? Dr. Fernandez-Becker?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Well, thank you all for signing up and attending today's webinar with Dr. Nielsen Fernandez-Becker of Stanford and Jennifer Iscol of Celiac Community Foundation of Northern California. This webinar is going to provide some more in-depth information about one of the many celiac disease clinical trials going on right now, called the Solutions for Celiac study, to help you determine if it's something that you want to consider joining. In the first part of this talk, Dr. Fernandez-Becker will explain the overall study design, why the research is needed, activities participants will be asked to do, time commitment, risk benefits, and how to get involved. And then after the presentation, which should take anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes, we'll open up to Q&A. This webinar is co-hosted by the Celiac Community Foundation of Northern California. And in a couple of minutes, we'll let Jennifer introduce her amazing organization here. To give a kind of like an administrative introduction, this is a webinar style presentation. So your cameras, all attendees' cameras and mics will be off, but feel free to add comments in the chat box. If you do have any questions that you would like to be answered in the Q&A, make sure to use the Q&A function in Zoom so that we don't lose your question in the chat box. And then we'll answer as many as we can live during the latter half of the webinar today. All right, and then so we'll move on to the next slide. So to get some legal things out of the way, the study is sponsored. The study and this webinar is sponsored by the company called Immunogen X, which is conducting the study under a grant from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, a division of the NIH. Dr. Fernandez-Becker is one of the principal investigators of the study. There are 5 other research sites participating, including in Minnesota, Tennessee, Illinois, New York, and Massachusetts. So if you have friends and families in those areas, we highly encourage you to share this study and presentation with them. The medication is investigational, meaning it has not cleared or been approved by the FDA yet, and these trials are being done in order to gather scientific evidence to help the FDA determine whether the medication is safe and effective for use and eventually hopefully receive approval. As mentioned earlier, this webinar is co-hosted by the Celiac Community Foundation of Northern California. We thank this organization for sharing this webinar with your members. So Jennifer, would you like to provide an introduction to your organization to all attendees?
Sure. Thank you so much, Pauline, and welcome to everyone who is joining us here today. As she said, I'm Jennifer Iskell, president of the Celiac Community Foundation of Northern California. We are pleased to have the opportunity to co-host this webinar and engage our local community with this important work. Our organization offers support, education, and advocacy for celiac disease and other gluten-related disorders. As an all-volunteer, independent nonprofit, we provide all of our services at no cost, including Camp Celiac. You can find us at celiaccommunity.org. As an important part of our mission, we support research and clinical trials that will eventually lead to treatment options and a greater understanding of celiac disease. Our foundation was originally a research nonprofit founded by Dr. Chetan Khosla of Stanford, whose work led to the invention of Lactoglutinase, the treatment that is the subject of today's webinar. I would like to thank the team at Immunogen X, as well as one of our favorite collaborators, Dr. Nielsen Fernandez-Becker, for their work. Dr. Fernandez-Becker, I turn it over to you.
Okay, great, thanks. So Pauline, can you stop sharing so that I will? I'm going to share my screen real quick. Okay. All right. So thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm very excited to be part of this webinar. I thought I'd start with telling you a little bit about myself. So I am currently clinical associate professor in medicine at in the Division of Gastroenterology and Hepatology at Stanford University. I joined Stanford in 2009. I did my medical training in the Harvard system in Boston. So my residency at Mass General, and I learned all about celiac disease at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, Celiac Center. I am currently the director of the celiac disease program at Stanford, and my priority really is to provide excellent patient care and also translational research that's designed to understand the pathophysiology of celiac disease at a deeper level and hopefully help us make discoveries and learn about potential targets for therapy. But above all is to improve the care of my patients, and clinical trials is an important aspect of that because we clearly need more therapies. Okay, so I'm going to start with why would you want to participate in a clinical trial? Well, in the last few years during the pandemic, we have seen that with widespread public participation, new therapies can be tested, authorized, and approved and made available to those who need it fairly quickly and safely. In celiac disease, as I said, we do need other therapies in addition to the gluten-free diet, because even though patients with celiac disease are on a gluten-free diet, many of them continue to experience symptoms and or intestinal damage while on the gluten-free diet. So finding other therapies that are not diet-based is crucial. As a person affected by celiac disease, you can play an important role in advancing the research in celiac disease by participating in a clinical trial. As mentioned before, Immunogen X is the sponsor is Immunogen X, which is a clinical stage company whose sole mission is to address the needs of patients with celiac disease. They are researching and developing Lactoglutinase, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, which is a combination of enzymes that's designed to break down gluten in the stomach. It was co-founded by Jennifer Seely-Voixner, PhD, who was diagnosed with celiac disease herself in 2002. And since then, she has dedicated her career to bettering the lives of those who suffer from celiac disease. So today we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of one of the many clinical trials that's going on, and this is Solutions for Celiac. If you're interested in learning more about the technical aspects of this, you could look up the clinical trial using the number that is located here in the right-hand corner of this slide. Okay, so let's talk about the study itself. Why are we doing this? As discussed earlier, we need other therapies in addition to the gluten-free diet to treat patients with celiac disease because many people remain symptomatic. And here, this drug in particular is designed to help patients avoid or minimize life disruptions that are due to accidental exposure of gluten. This is a clinical trial that's being conducted to validate whether, in addition to an investigational medication, investigational medication to one's diet reduces the typical symptoms experienced due to accidental exposure of gluten. And what we'll talk about specifically is Lactoglutinase, which is a mixture of two enzymes that are designed to break down gluten in the stomach before it reaches and damages the lining of the small intestine. And the trial will involve up to 6 visits over the course of 26 weeks. Each visit lasts about 1 to 2 hours, and the visits tend to occur about every month to 1.5 months. And today, we'll talk to you about our site, although we're located in Northern California, in Redwood City, part of Stanford Medicine, but there are 5 other locations, and reimbursement for travel may be provided during the study. Okay, so let's talk about Lactoglutinase. What is it? So when a word ends with ACE, it indicates that it is an enzyme. And this enzyme, Lactoglutinase, is one, as Jennifer mentioned, was discovered by Dr. Chetan Khosla, and it breaks down gluten. So what happens in celiac disease is that gluten gets broken down into peptides or into fragments of the protein. And it is those fragments that will then be recognized by the immune cells in the intestine. And that's what causes the inflammation that results in damage to the lining of the small intestine. Lactoglutinase is designed to break down those small peptides so that gluten could no longer activate the immune response and injure the lining. It is, in the study, it is formulated as a powder that is dissolved in water with a flavoring packet. So think about it as an energy drink that is drank with the major meal. In the hopes are that if there is some gluten, then in the meal, then the Lactoglutinase can break down that small amount of gluten so that it can't injure your small intestine. The study is placebo-controlled and blinded. And this means that, so you will take both the active medication and the placebo medication during different parts of the study. That means that you will serve as your own control. And when we talk about placebo, the placebo means that it looks exactly like the medication that we're testing, but it doesn't have the activity. So some people call this dummy drug. And this is important for us to know for us to be able to pick up changes that are specific to the active protein. And this is one of the things that is essential in clinical trials. And it's blinded, it's actually double blinded, which means that neither the study team or the participant will know which you're taking when. So even though at some point you'll be taking placebo and other times you will be taking active drug, but neither of us will know. So what does the enrollment entail? So first there will be a screening visit, and there are certain eligibility criteria that you need to meet. So the age is 18 to 80 years old. So this is a study for adults. And we require that that the diagnosis of celiac disease has been biopsy confirmed, and the participant must be on a gluten-free diet for at least 12 months. They have to have an antibody test at the time of the screening visit, and also report recent symptoms associated with accidental gluten exposure. There are certain conditions that would disqualify you from participating in the study. And these include type 1 diabetes, refractory celiac disease, active colitis, active peptic ulcer disease, esophagitis, dermatitis herpetiformis, IBS, inflammatory bowel disease, and functional dyspepsia. And the reason for this is that these conditions can cause symptoms, and these symptoms could be what we call confounding. So if there's changes that occur, it would be hard to tell whether it's due to the treatment versus these medical conditions. And in addition, some conditions may interfere with the activity of our medication, which would be another reason for there to be disqualifying medical conditions. It is important to note that it is also a case-by-case basis, and additional criteria may apply that we would go over at the time of the screening visit. Okay, so let's go over the study events and the timeline. So the first step would be a pre-screen visit and consent to participate. And there will need to be complete antibody testing to determine if you are eligible. At visit 1, there's a physical exam, urine and blood test, and the patients will start, or the participants will start, daily symptom diary. At visit 2, that's when the study treatment starts. And you know, symptom diary, visit 1 is actually very important because part of what we're following is symptoms. So participants have to be able to meet a certain threshold of symptoms in order to move on to visit 2. At visit 2, that's when the treatment period starts, and we continue to monitor symptom diary. And here, again, this is what we're tracking to see, part of what we're tracking to see if the medication is doing what it should. And there's 3 study periods. The first study period occurs between visit 2 and visit 3. And during that time, we're following questionnaires, urine and blood test, and daily symptom diary. Then there is the second period. And at visit 4, questionnaires and daily symptom diary checks occur. And finally, there's period 3, and the end of the study, there is, again, questionnaires, a physical exam, urine, blood samples, and wrap-up of the study. I would like to note that for this study, besides the blood draws, there are no study-related biopsies, injections, infusions, or surgeries, which sometimes is necessary for clinical trials. So you may be wondering, why include gluten? So many clinical trials with celiac disease involve introduction of gluten. And the reason for that is that in celiac disease, gluten is the culprit. And when we're developing medications to treat celiac disease, we have to test the ability of those medications to protect the intestinal lining from inflammation induced by gluten. And in this study, this is done, a small amount of gluten will be included in the form of snacks. Now, these snacks are commercially available. And some snacks will have a small amount of gluten, other snacks will not. Part of the nature of the study is that you won't know when you're consuming a snack that contains gluten or not. Now, the reason for the snacks is that initially the study was designed before the pandemic, when people were going out to dinner a lot and encountering cross-contamination. But after the pandemic, dining habits changed and people were staying home more. So part of the design change that occurred in response to that was that the snacks were introduced as a way to simulate cross-contamination with small amounts of gluten. And this is a small amount, which occurs about once a week. And it should not cause any lasting damage. It may induce a transient inflammation that after the discontinuation of it should not cause any lasting damage. In order for there to be systemic inflammatory changes induced from gluten, it requires 2 to 4 full servings of gluten every day for several months, for 2 to 3 months. So that's not what's happening here. So it is critical in most early celiac studies to include gluten as part of the equation. And in a clinical trial, the amount of gluten exposure is very well controlled, as are all of the components of the clinical trial, so that we could understand whether the mechanism, whether the medication is able to to counteract the effects of the gluten. And the snacks are, as I mentioned, these are snacks that are commercially available. And they are, the gluten-containing snacks will be eaten less than twice a month. And the equivalent of gluten in these snacks, of the ones that do contain gluten, is approximately the size of the equivalent of half of a slice of bread, which is about 2 grams of gluten. Okay, so what happens after? If you participate in the trial, it's important for you to know that your data is anonymized and kept confidential. This is not something that is shared with any entities outside of the confines of the clinical trial, and no one would know your name. The results of the clinical trials are published at least 1 year after the study ends. And this is because there's a lot of data analysis that has to occur, and the rigorous statistical analyses and such. Multiple studies are combined and submitted to the FDA, and the final results of this study will be available on clinicaltrials.gov. You could always visit the sponsor site, immunogenx.com, and follow on Beyond Celiac or Celiac Disease Foundation for research news. So, are clinical trials safe? Important to remember that clinical trials are very highly regulated. And the studies are designed according to international guidelines that are called good clinical practice, that all the all of the individuals in the research team are required to be trained in. In addition, institutional review boards review these to ensure that the participants' rights and safety and privacy are protected. All clinical trials carry risks and benefit, so it's important to consult with your primary care provider and the study team to make sure that this trial is right for you. And in terms of the medication, I will tell you that this medication has been evaluated in 9 clinical trials previously, and this encompasses almost close to 800 patients. And you could find the publications for this by doing a search on the web, looking at Lactoglutinase clinical trials. The medication has been deemed to be safe, and the side effects related to the medication have been mostly mild intestinal symptoms and have been very different from the placebo. And you can enroll via several different ways. You could talk directly with the Stanford research team by going to www.solutionsforceliac.com. You can also fill out a pre-screener online at www.solutionsforceliac.com survey. If you are pre-qualified study member, if you're pre-qualified after filling this survey, a study member will call you and ask you more additional questions. And finally, if you qualify, you'll then schedule your first in-person visit at Stanford. Our lead coordinator is Diana Suki, who is on the webinar today, and this is her email. And I think that I will wrap things up there and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for going through the presentation there, Dr. Fernandez-Becker. Hopefully that was informative for everyone that was attending here. And I failed to introduce Diana earlier. As mentioned, Diana, who is also the other panelist on the webinar today, she is the study coordinator. So Diana and Dr. Fernandez-Becker are the team that any participants would meet with if you were to enroll into the study. All right, so we did have some questions submitted during registration that I'd like to share for Dr. Fernandez-Becker to answer. One of the main questions we got over and over again was, what is the age range for the study, and what are the reasons for selecting the lower limit and the upper limit?
Sure. So the age range is 18 to 80 years old. And the reason 18 was chosen is because under the age of 18, there is a requirement, in a lot of regulatory requirements for safety reasons. And the cutoff for being an adult in a clinical trial is 18. So that's the lower end. The 80 was more related to limitations, age-related limitations of clinical trials in the elderly population.
Great, thank you for that. And there's two additional questions related to that. One of them is like, why aren't there as many clinical trials for pediatric or pediatric patients or kids? And the second one would be, someone mentioned some other clinical trials limiting it to age 70. I'm not familiar with that, but yeah, I don't know if you
Well, I think every clinical trial is unique. And in terms of clinical trials in kids, children, more regulation and more rigor sometimes is required there, because really the effects of some of the interventions aren't clearly understood. And children are still growing. There's a lot of factors at play. So the decision as to whether to perform a clinical trial in children versus adult versus both really is different from one clinical trial to the next, and it also relates to the risk-benefit evaluation. And sorry, what was the other part of the question?
I think someone mentioned about clinical studies commonly limiting the upper age range to age 70, but like this one doesn't.
Got it. This one doesn't. And again, it's also looking at the risk benefit because every clinical trial is unique because it's a different drug that might be tested, which may have different risks. For instance, I was involved in a clinical trial before where the age limit was basically related to the fact that as we get older, our kidney function declines naturally. And the medication was something that was cleared by the kidneys. So those kinds of calculations have to go into the determination of the age.
Thank you. Hopefully that answered everyone's age questions there. There's a couple of different forms of that. The next question here is, does the powder contain sucrose or other artificial sweeteners?
So I actually looked up what's in the powder. There is a small amount of sucrose and also a small amount of sucralose, mannitol, but not at very high levels. And it's important also to know that, again, this is commercially available, and trying to minimize
not the medication, but the
not the medication, the snack. So the snacks may contain some slight traces of some of the allergens, but including wheat, dairy, eggs, fish, peanuts. So this is something that we would go over, obviously, during the screening visit as well, to go over people's allergies and such.
Thank you. Another person asked, what are the side effects of the investigational medication Lactoglutinase, and is it only good for minimal levels associated with accidental gluten exposure?
So the looking at the clinical trials that was done on this medication, the side effect profile was very similar to that of the placebo or the dummy drug. And those were mainly gastrointestinal symptoms that were on the milder end. Sorry, in the second half of that question?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I combined two questions into one. Their follow-on question was, is the medication only good for minimal levels associated with accidental gluten exposure?
So it's been tested looking at the exposure to, of whether it protects against exposure to about 2 grams of gluten. And to put things into perspective, 2 grams is about half of a slice of bread. So that's what so far has been proven that it can do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think if I understand it, most people who follow a gluten-free diet, if they do accidentally have gluten cross-contamination, it's maybe like a speck or something, and not as much as 2 grams of gluten. So this
exactly. So it's much. So in the clinical trials, it's been shown to protect against much higher doses that we would expect from mere cross-contamination.
Gotcha. Great. The next question I have here is it possible to grow out of celiac disease?
That's a very interesting question that we get often. And celiac disease is really not an allergy in the strict sense of what we think of with an allergy. Like a peanut allergy, celiac disease is an autoimmune disease that's triggered by the protein gluten. And unfortunately, in a patient with celiac disease, anytime that they see gluten, the immune response reacts as if it's a potential bad infectious agent or something and reacts. And the only way that we can treat that is by taking gluten out of the equation, and that's gluten exclusion. So in a patient with celiac disease, gluten is a poison. And unfortunately, this is not something that people grow out of. And again, many people, even though they're very diligently following the gluten-free diet, continue to be symptomatic. Which is why it's important for research like this to occur.
Cool. Thank you. Someone asked here, can you enroll in this study if you are IgA deficient?
That is actually a good question. I think it is possible. However, you have to meet the other criteria, which means that the celiac antibodies have to be positive at the screening visit. And in the case of IgA deficiency, it would have to be, which affects about 2% of patients with celiac disease, the IgG component of the antibodies would be the more important ones.
Oh, that makes sense. Thank you. Some other people ask, when is like the most hopeful date of getting this to the public? Or a similar question that someone asked is, when is the time to market?
Yeah, from my understanding, time to market is 2026. And so hopefully relatively soon.
Yep. It takes a lot of years of research to bring a medication to market. So
absolutely, it requires a lot of rigorous work because we need, understandably, there has to be a lot of analysis into the safety and the efficacy of a medication before the FDA approves it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. This major question, or another question is, what are some of the other intestinal issues that tend to occur with celiac disease?
Okay, well, celiac disease is really interesting in that the spectrum of disease can be so broad. We have on one end patients who cannot even tell when they are exposed to gluten, even though they have injury in the lining, and a lot of the symptoms are extraintestinal. And but many patients do experience symptoms, and most of the time it is intestinal. So common symptoms are diarrhea, bloating, constipation sometimes, and what we call this dyspepsia, which is almost like what we call, it would be what one would call indigestion. There are diseases that coexist with celiac disease as well. Like about a third of the patient with celiac disease may also have irritable bowel syndrome. Some patients experience diarrhea from having microscopic colitis, which is basically, it's not inflammatory bowel disease, so I'm not talking about ulcerative colitis. It's a condition where the lining of the colon looks grossly normal if I were to do a colonoscopy, but when you take biopsies and look at it at the microscopic level, there is inflammation. And this could be difficult to treat and doesn't always respond to a gluten-free diet. Patients with celiac disease may also develop a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or intolerances to certain sugars, lactose being the most common.
Interesting. Yeah, and I think we've heard a lot of people get diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome, and then later they get diagnosed with celiac disease, but it may actually be that it was a misdiagnosis.
Yes.
Would you comment about that?
Absolutely. And, unfortunately, even in this day and age, this still occurs. And part of the reason is because the symptoms could be nonspecific. As I mentioned, the disease spectrum can be so broad. And some of the symptoms are very similar to what you would have with irritable bowel syndrome. I will say, though, that the guidelines for diagnosing irritable bowel have changed in the last few years. And they recommend testing for celiac disease first before diagnosing somebody with irritable bowel syndrome, which I think will help. I mean, if people adhere to it, that is. But as part of our guidelines now, before we make the diagnosis of IBS, we should be testing celiac serologies.
Oh, that's good to hear that will be hopefully implemented more often so people get the correct diagnosis.
Right. So a lot of what I try to do is to educate the community at large, because a lot of times these diagnoses are not made by a gastroenterologist, but are made by primary care doctors in the community. So part of what we try to do at Stanford is to reach community practices and perpetually try to educate as more scientific data becomes available.
So, let's see here. Which one should I go first? Does celiac disease affect weakening of the bones?
So celiac disease is a systemic disease. It could affect many aspects of the body in multiple ways. One of the more, in terms of complications of celiac, some are directly due to malabsorption, or, the small intestine is 22 feet long and it's designed to absorb most nutrients. So I like to tell people, you could live without a stomach, you could live without a colon, you cannot live without the small intestine, because that is where you absorb most nutrients. And yes, weakening of the bones is part of it, because it is the small intestine where fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin D are absorbed. So one of the things that we do in patients with celiac disease is that we screen for decreased bone density, and we're proactive about treating it and repleting vitamins, micronutrients that could be lost.
That's very good. Yeah, definitely. I've heard of a lot of people definitely missing out on a lot of nutrients because it's not getting absorbed through the intestine. But then also because of the diet, they're unfortunately have to cut certain foods out, and that's not getting the nutrients from a normal rounded diet.
Right, and which is part of the reason also why we always involve a dietitian that has expertise with celiac disease to make sure that individuals are getting a balanced diet, and also, to reinforce the principles of what a gluten-free diet should be.
Oh, very good. Someone asked here, what are the remaining steps of the clinical trial process to get this medication to market?
Well, I think that completing this will be one of many trials, and in the past, this drug has been shown to be most effective is in individuals who continue to have positive serologies and continue to have symptoms despite being on a gluten-free diet. This study is specifically designed to look at that specific population to get more data. I think in the end it'll be determined by the FDA, but having very convincing evidence that this drug is accomplishing what we think it is, or what we're hypothesizing it is going to be the requirement. It's hard to say for sure because that's ultimately up to the FDA.
Mm-hmm. I believe this is a phase 2 trial, and there's usually 3 phases,
phase
right?
3, which is right. So thank you for reminding me of that. Yes. So phase 2, before a drug is approved, it usually requires phase 3, which is a lot more numbers of patients. Again, looking at safety and looking at efficacy. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, even after the phase 3 trial, it'll be the FDA's decision based on the quality of the data.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's usually like it's not just one study that's submitted to the FDA. It would be results from pretty much most of the studies throughout the medication's history being submitted, right?
Exactly.
Gotcha. Awesome. So we another question someone asked, is anyone researching medication for purposeful gluten eating? Like what's available for lactose? Like having a pill and then being able to eat like a slice of normal pizza.
I mean, I think there's been some iterations of that. There's nothing really that has been shown to be very effective yet. But I think that definitely is something that's being looked into. Medications of many different mechanisms of action, including medications that are tailored to make whenever patients with active celiac disease have increased permeability, or what we would call the leaky gut, and there are medications that are looking at whether you're able to correct that permeability defect, and if that's the case, will you be able to eat gluten? I don't think there's anything yet that looks promising enough to replace the gluten-free diet. So I haven't seen anything that will make it eating purposeful gluten really a reality in the near future. But this is a field, celiac disease is an area which is a lot of really intense interest in understanding the underlying pathophysiology, because it is the one autoimmune disease that we know that is modular. We know so much about it. We know that it starts with gluten and it ends up in autoimmunity. So people are interested in studying this because it gives you a window into autoimmunity in general. So I am really hopeful that the more we understand this disease process, the better position we're going to be to treat it. And who knows, even cure it. I don't know when, but the future looks bright.
Yeah, definitely. There's so many researchers across the US, across the world, all approaching treatment of celiac disease in different aspects. And only together with the help of the community can we move towards that future of a cure.
Absolutely. And I'm also always incredibly grateful to our patients who participate in many of the studies that we have going on at Stanford and in clinical trials, because this is a human disease and this is really the only way that we're going to advance the field. So thank you.
Cool. And I'm just going to present one more question here and then leave the last couple of minutes just kind of to wrap up and give last parting words to yourself, Dr. Fernandez-Becker, Diana, and Jennifer. One person asked, what are the next steps that you'd recommend for patients that have had a clear endoscopy? I'm guessing they mean a clear endoscopic diagnosis of celiac disease. They've followed a gluten-free diet, but they still have elevated levels, I think is...
Yes, so I looked, so I assumed that by elevated levels, we mean elevated serologies or antibodies. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I would say that there's probably not a one-size-fits-all answer. That is definitely a case by case. One thing that I will say is that while these antibodies are really helpful to make the diagnosis of celiac disease, they're not very helpful at all to tell us of the health of the small intestine. And that's an area, that's an unmet need. We don't have really great non-invasive clinical markers that give us that tell us about how healthy the small intestine is. And after you're on a gluten-free diet. Unfortunately, that's why we have to rely on biopsies. Again, this is an area of very intense research. So I would say it depends. It depends on how high the antibody is. If it's, I don't worry too much if the antibody is just barely positive and we started out really high. And also the kinetics of how long it takes these antibodies to go away differ from one person to another. On average, it takes 6 months to a year for the antibodies to go away. But if they started out really high, it could take much longer than that. So I think it's important not just to follow the antibodies. It's the whole picture, how the symptoms are, the biopsies obviously help, and the trajectory of those. So I think it would be important to be followed by someone who has expertise in celiac disease, just to make sure that there's nothing else. And if everything's okay and the antibodies aren't really that high, I don't worry too much. But it is a case by case.
That's very good recommendations there. Definitely looking at the whole picture of the person, their history, and not just like a point in time level there. Cool, thank you. All right, so I think that was the last question. I do want to highlight a very nice comment that someone put in here saying, I want to encourage folks to participate in this study. This person seems to be is a mother of someone with celiac disease and truly understands the struggle. And says being gluten-free is easy, but celiac and cross-contamination is the enemy. Thank you for your comment there. And yeah, appreciate your attendance and participation in this webinar and also in celiac disease research. Cool. All right. So if there are no other burning questions that anyone has, I'll hand it back. Maybe we'll give Jennifer a chance to give some parting remarks about your organization. If you have any maybe upcoming events you want to share too with the community.
Oh, thanks, Pauline. Well, that was very interesting. And the Q&A was also great questions. So just thanks to the Immunogen X team and the team at Stanford and to everyone joining today or watching later. We feel fortunate that Stanford is one of the study sites and that our community has a way to help move this forward by considering participation in this study. So again, you can find our organization at celiaccommunity.org and join our list and learn about our events that way. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you. I don't know if Diana, you want to maybe introduce yourself to people since you may be a first point of contact for anyone interested in signing up.
Thank you, Pauline. Thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. If you are interested in joining our study or know someone who is, please feel free to contact me at dsouki@stanford.edu. And we can look forward into discussing the study in further detail and seeing if you would be a great candidate.
And then I don't know if you wanted to say anything to Dr. Fernandez-Becker, and then I'll explain like the recordings and the emails afterwards.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And again, I appreciate very much your consideration to participate in a clinical trial. I know that it is a sacrifice, and in some regard, you're doing it for the greater good, but that is very much appreciated because it is some better treatments for celiac disease are very much needed. We're happy to answer any questions that you may have, and we are, in Redwood City, in Northern California, I am so thankful to Jennifer for always being such a wonderful collaborator, and also the team at Immunogen X. And hopefully, I'm hoping that this will be a success.
Cool. Well, great. Thank you so much. All right. Again, thank you all the attendees for coming. I do want to let you know that this event was recorded. And so in a couple of days, we'll share a link to the recording in case you want to rewatch it, or you want to share the recording with anyone that might be interested. We'll also send the slides so that, and the links that you saw in the presentation are clickable, so you can navigate to the study website, the clinicaltrials.gov page, get the contact information for Diana, etc. And then you'll have our contact information if you want to follow up with any questions. And we'll also, of course, include the links to the Celiac Community Foundation's website too. All right. I guess with that, we'll just wrap things up. And again, extend our thanks to you all. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend, and happy Thanksgiving.
Bye-bye.
Bye.